Hello, and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. When the delegates to the Continental Congress voted to adopt the American Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, it certainly never occurred to them that one day there would be a very special relationship between the United States and what they saw at the time as the British Empire. After all, they proclaimed King George III a tyrant and unfit to be ruler of a free people. And in turn, the king called the colonists traitors. Yet almost 9 years later, John Adams traveled to St. James Palace and presented his diplomatic credentials to King George. After 8 years of war, the future second president had a royal audience with his once bitter enemy. To his surprise, Adams was greeted by a magnanimous King George, who offered friendship to the fledgling nation. From that point on, aside from the War of 1812 and that little fire that the British set to the White House in the city of Washington, there would be a centuries-long relationship that would develop and grow with each president's administration and with each reigning monarch. And certainly no British monarch has reigned longer than Queen Elizabeth II. And Americans have held a fascination with the British monarchy, and even the birth of the young princess in 1926 was news all across America. She was the third in line to the throne at that time, behind her father and her uncle, and no one really foresaw that at the time she would one day become queen and have her own remarkable legacy. And we examine that legacy today with our guest, David Charter. David is the U.S. editor of the Times of London and the author of Royal Audience, 70 Years, 13 Presidents, One Queen's Special Relationship with America. This new book examines that special relationship between a queen and the United States, and between the United States and the United Kingdom over 7 decades and 13 presidents, from Harry Truman to Joe Biden. There's a lot to get into, David, so let's dive right in. And I'm really taken by that subtitle, 70 Years and 13 Presidents. She had as much history with the American presidency, or more history with American presidents, than probably any president had with other presidents. There's probably not many American presidents who met 12 additional presidents. So we talk about the special relationship between your country and our country, but this is a special relationship between a queen and our country. What inspired you to write this book and take this focus?
Thank you, Stuart. That's a fantastic introduction. And you're right, for many Brits and many Americans, of course, Queen Elizabeth II was the only monarch that they knew. And she got to know, I think, pretty well, 13 presidents of the 14 during her very long reign. And she really came to sum up, I think, and embody the special feeling between our two countries, because it meant so much to her personally. And you can see that when you just look back at her formative years during the Second World War. It made an incredibly deep impression upon her, the way that the Americans joining the war was the turning of the tide, and set up the post-war world of democracies that, incongruously, as the hereditary heir to 11 centuries of monarchs, she was the head of state of the British democracy, and she came to regard America's democracy with just as much fondness, I think.
You mention and make the point just now that she met 13 of the 14 presidents during her reign. So there was one she did not meet. Who was that and why?
So that's LBJ. It's not that he didn't have warm feelings for America's British allies, generally speaking, but there were several mishaps that led to really an accident of history that they never met, because the Queen would certainly have attended and wanted to attend the funeral of JFK, but her doctors prevented her from going because she was in her 4th pregnancy at the time. And similarly, another medical crisis actually intervened when, just about a year later, Winston Churchill passed away, and Johnson really wanted to come to the great man's funeral. Churchill, of course, half American, is an American mother, but moreover, very well respected and regarded in America as the great wartime leader in Britain. But LBJ caught an infection at his inauguration that January 1965, and the condition worsened, and it prevented Johnson from leaving to come to London. So, but for those two accidents of history, they would certainly have met. Having said that, as Johnson's presidency progressed and the war in Vietnam consumed him, he spent his time focusing on those countries that were important to him and contributing to the war. And we had a Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, who refused to send British troops despite Johnson's request to join the fighting in Vietnam. And although they met, Wilson and Johnson, on several occasions for political reasons, the atmospherics were not right for Johnson to cross the Atlantic to Britain. In fact, he only visited Europe twice during his entire presidency.
Well, there's also a story of the young Princess Elizabeth and a young Jack Kennedy when his father is ambassador, and they actually met on that occasion.
So this is a really extraordinary quirk of history, that when the young JFK took some time out from Harvard to go and visit his father in London just shortly before the war, he was introduced into royal circles because Joseph Kennedy would frequently meet with the king for high-level discussions at the time. And at one of these gatherings, the 12-year-old Princess Elizabeth was introduced to the 21-year-old JFK, and they had a discussion. Now, not much is known about it, apart from the fact that Jack Kennedy, he wrote to his best friend Lem Billings about this encounter with the young princess, with whom I had a fine time, although the subject matter is covered.
That's probably a good thing, I would suppose.
But it's extraordinary that at one stage or other, those two young people would become the most famous people in the world, that they would have an afternoon's conversation, presumably at Buckingham Palace.
Of course, she would have dreamed at that time that she one day would have become a queen, but he never would have imagined that he would have become president. That's quite interesting. World War II, young princess, was not held up in robes and jewels, but she was actually involved. What was her role and how was she active in the war movement that she would have had an opportunity to see firsthand and feel more directly the impact and the relationship between the two countries?
Extraordinarily, Elizabeth was around the table for diplomatic meetings during the build-up to the war with Joseph Kennedy, the then American ambassador to London, for example, when high-level discussions were taking place with the Prime Minister, her father, the King, and other important officials when she was really still a teenager. And as the war developed, she herself wanted to join the war effort and trained as a mechanic in uniform towards the end of the hostilities in 1945, because at the time the royal family were emblematic of the British war effort and wanted to show that they were alongside the people of Britain who had signed up to fight. And so moreover, she saw Eisenhower in his role as the leading general who organized D-Day, which was perhaps one of the most crucial single days of the entire war, when America joined British and other European forces to re-invade Europe. That was the moment when the whole of Britain held its breath and saw how America's involvement was crucial to defeating Nazism, and it made an indelible impact on the Queen and forever gave her an appreciation of the American commitment to freedom and democracy that she maintained. And then later in life, of course, she was the custodian of these memories that were fading in subsequent decades and presidencies, about the importance of the defense of democracy and the commitment to the multinational institutions that were set up to safeguard that in the Western world.
At that time, she was third in line to the throne. Her uncle was king, and her father became king through an unusual twist that involved an American relationship of a different sort. Had her father not become king and she not become queen, what might her life and her career have been? What would you speculate she would have done with her life?
That's a fascinating what if, and I think she would have been a working member of the royal family, carrying out various ceremonial, diplomatic perhaps, functions on missions that some of the more minor royals do carry out. Princess Margaret met LBJ when he was vice president, when they both represented their countries at the independence ceremonies for Jamaica, for example. These were the kind of events that the head of state perhaps wouldn't attend, but would send a deputy to go along to. But bear in mind that her uncle, who stood aside to allow her father to become king, he never had children, meaning that she would have been the heir apparent. She would have become queen at that time when her uncle died. So actually, it was all along in the stars, in her destiny.
So, as the U.S. editor of the Times of London, you have a front row seat to the people, the places, the things that we are involved with here at the White House Historical Association. Do you recall the first American president you would have seen, and your first feelings looking at these monuments and memorials in the White House itself?
The memory that immediately comes to mind, Stuart, is that before coming to America, I was a political correspondent in London when George W. Bush had his state visit and gave a speech in Whitehall in the banqueting house. That was really a terrific speech. There were protesters outside, anti-war protesters, I believe. There was an absolutely crowded scene inside the banqueting house in Whitehall. And he delivered a knockout speech, actually joking about how just recently the American magician David Blaine had been suspended above the Thames in a glass box, and that there were a lot of people who might like to do that to me, but fortunately the Queen is putting me up at Buckingham Palace. So it was his humour, as much as anything, I think won over a British audience there. And I just thought that was a real indication of the warmth built by a personal connection between George W. Bush and Queen Elizabeth II, that he could present such a funny joke to break the ice in such a big formal occasion.
Well, she had quite a sense of humor as well, didn't she?
She had a great sense of humor, mainly in private. She was a great mimic, and that has been seen even after her first visit with President Truman, that she gave an audience to the American press, which was quite rowdy with all the press people trying to get questions in. And a few days later, when she departed Washington, D.C. back to Canada to continue with a tour of Canada, she had, for some of the Canadian journalists, she'd mimicked the way that the American press were hurling questions at her, and the photographers were trying to get her to look in a certain way. But she was not averse to delivering a joke on the big stage. And you may notice on the front of the book,
yes,
there's
one of my favorite pictures from the Reagan presidency.
Really an iconic photograph of the special relationship, I would say, with Reagan throwing his head back and throwing his hand up and laughing uproariously, because this was in California, where there was supposed to be a bunch of ceremonies, including a return horse ride with Reagan's own horses on his ranch. But the rain never stopped falling for about 7 or 8 days straight in California. And the Queen quipped during her speech that, "I know America has imported a lot of our traditions, but I didn't realize the weather was one of them." And that was the moment caught so well in that photograph.
Yeah, this is so great of President Reagan, just the guffawing laughter that he has in response to her joke there. And clearly they had a wonderful rapport, the two of them, both loving horses, and I think really just becoming good friends through the course of that presidency.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, what I've referred to just then is a year before, there was Reagan's first visit to the UK as president, when he was hosted by Queen Elizabeth. And the very special public event of that trip was to organise a horse ride around the grounds of Windsor Great Park near her Windsor Castle, when there was a lot of diplomatic back and forth actually about what type of horse does the president like and what type of saddle. And the White House was asked, well, what should he wear, and how far are you going to go? And the Secret Service was really quite nervous about it. Where could they follow in a vehicle? They apparently were dotted around the enormous grounds of Windsor Park to keep an eye on the security of the president. And that, again, I would say there are two perhaps iconic photographs of the Queen with President. One of those is on the front of the book. The other one is of the joint horse ride, because what other heads of state ever take a horse ride together in the name of diplomacy and enhancing international relations? I think it's never happened before.
I believe the story is, or at least the lore is, that the Secret Service and President Reagan's staff wanted to transport his horse over so he would be more familiar and comfortable, but the palace said, no, you'll ride on our horses, and he did, and all was well.
That's right. The horse actually was a gift from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So it was a North American horse anyway.
And when she came on this trip, I understand, so much thought is given into the gifts that are exchanged between both heads of state. And I think she actually requested, she had heard of an American computer company producing a program that told of the bloodlines and the lineage of all of the racehorses, and that she could track it and trace it. And that's what she requested to receive as her official gift, which is really interesting to me. Not a crystal vase or some beautiful object, but she was into her horse racing. And she, in fact, went to Kentucky, didn't she?
Yes, just on the computer, Stuart. It was the perfect opportunity because they were in California, the home of Hewlett Packard.
Yes.
The head of the company invited the Queen not only to use some of the demonstration models of their latest computers, but to take one as a gift. And it was seen later in her private offices in Buckingham Palace being used to log her many horses that were out for breeding and racing, to keep a track of them. So that was a gift that, instead of gathering dust in a museum, that was put to use. That was a very well received gift.
That's wonderful. And she went to Kentucky, didn't she, where our greatest horse race, the Kentucky Derby, is held?
The Queen had several private holidays in America, actually, during the 1980s to visit with horse breeding and horse racing friends in Kentucky. But she hadn't been to the Kentucky Derby. So the opportunity arose on her last state visit to America in 2007. She wanted to arrive in Virginia to go to the Jamestown settlement, where she'd been 50 years earlier, actually, to see developments. But curiously, she was a week early for the main Jamestown anniversary celebrations that year. And although people may have been scratching their heads a bit, it became obvious a couple of days later when she, after Jamestown, went to Kentucky so she could see the running of the Derby that year. That was why she was a little bit early in Jamestown, and enjoyed watching the race with her American horse racing friends.
Well, let's go back to her earliest visit. Her first visit was with Philip, and it was before she was Queen.
That's right. It was a detour, actually, from a big tour of Canada, which lasted several weeks. But President Truman was very keen that the Princess, then Duchess of Edinburgh, and the Duke of Edinburgh, made a visit in 1951. So she first set foot on American soil at National Airport when she flew in October 1951, and was greeted by enormous crowds all the way into the White House, perhaps swollen a little bit by the fact that Truman had given all the federal workers the afternoon off so they could come and watch the parade coming into town. But Truman seemed to be knocked out by this young princess, only 25 years old. Her trip had been slightly delayed because her father was ill and had to have a very serious operation around the time she was due to set off for Canada. But with all that in the background, and a slight feeling that she was heading towards becoming a very young queen. In fact, her private secretary in his briefcase had various official accession papers in his briefcase just in case the worst happened, because the king was by then rather poorly and would actually not survive another year. But notwithstanding all of that, she had already got to know Margaret Truman, the president's daughter, who'd visited London that summer. They'd already struck up that relationship, which was rekindled when she came to Washington. And although it was, I think, less than 48 hours, it was one of those very, I think, exciting post-war experiences. Certainly, as far as Britain was concerned, 1951 still felt like we were coming out of the doldrums.
Certainly.
After the Second World War. And to visit with our great ally, America, it was a special thing. In fact, no British royal had even flown across the Atlantic before. there were a number of firsts on that trip, and that was one of them.
Well, ironic that she stayed at the president's guest house, Blair House. Not unusual for a foreign visitor, guest of the president, but the president himself, President Truman, and his family were also staying there, having moved out of the White House for 4 years for that renovation. So you had the Trumans and Elizabeth and Philip staying under the roof of Blair House, which was an interesting dynamic. She wasn't able to stay in the White House on that occasion.
Not on that occasion, and also in one of the upstairs rooms was President Truman's mother-in-law, who was a little aged and rather deaf, but she was aware that Winston Churchill had just been re-elected Prime Minister while the Queen was on the tour, actually. And so Truman thought he'd better introduce the new house guest to his mother-in-law and basically shouted at her, "Mother, here's Princess Elizabeth come over from England." And Truman's mother-in-law, her words were, "Oh, I'm so delighted to meet you, and also that your father has been re-elected."
Oh my goodness. Well, maybe she got a laugh out of that. When was the next time she visited the United States, when she was queen on that occasion?
Queen Elizabeth's first state visit to America was in 1957, and quite amazingly, the relationship had taken a bit of a downturn. There'd been a British military adventure to retake the Suez Canal in Egypt. It was a really highly important trade route for European trade, and the British and French actually were worried that it would fall into the sole hands of the Egyptian leader at the time, and they sent soldiers to take control of it, but without telling Eisenhower, the American president, in advance of this invasion, when their shots were fired and several people were killed on each side. And it was outrageous to Eisenhower that his great wartime ally had invaded a sovereign country, Egypt, but moreover had put the world at risk of perhaps another conflagration. And he told the British Prime Minister at the time, in no uncertain terms, America does not support this, and we will do all we can to force you out of there if you don't pull out now. And he was serious about it. He was insinuating that he would have dumped British sterling bonds, which could have collapsed the British economy, and the British had no alternative and the French to withdraw the troops. And it was the Prime Minister resigned. It was a terrible incident for transatlantic relations, which began to improve when we got a new Prime Minister called Harold Macmillan, who was affable and got along with Eisenhower. But moreover, I think it was the Queen stepping in for a state visit that was arranged between Eisenhower and Macmillan to really cement the improvement in relations between the two countries that had been so jeopardized by this incident known as Suez. And this was all the backdrop to the Queen's, as I say, first and very successful state visit, where Eisenhower welcomed her with open arms. They knew each other from the wartime years. He was like a father figure in a way, because he had visited with her parents to Balmoral Castle and spent time there with the royal family in that most private of settings. In fact, the only president ever to be invited to Balmoral Castle, both by King George VI and later by Queen Elizabeth II. It's a private family holiday retreat, as I say, for the family. And so not even many members of the British aristocracy would ever have been invited to spend the night at Balmoral Castle. And all of this showed all of this closeness on the personal level between the Eisenhowers, plural, and the royal family generally, because the Eisenhowers were very friendly with the Queen Mother. She'd been on a solo visit, and she had stayed in the Queen's bedroom in the White House. In fact, the Queen's bedroom probably began to get its name when the first visit of the Queen and the King in 1939 with FDR, when they stayed in that room. And so all of that combined to improve the atmospherics between the countries.
So President Eisenhower gets this special invitation to visit Balmoral in Scotland and enjoys something there that he asked for the recipe of, which she actually sent to him in her own hand. Tell us that story.
That's right. And not only was Eisenhower, of course, singled out for this treat, this special treatment of staying at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, but he shared a picnic with the royal family one afternoon in the grounds. One of the things that he got to sample was drop scones, This is a bit like an American pancake, really. It's called drop just because you drop the batter on a hot surface to make the scone. And Elizabeth had promised to send him a copy of the recipe. In fact, Susan Eisenhower, Eisenhower's granddaughter, told me this was not untypical of her grandfather to take an interest in it because he was the cook in the family. He had a kitchen installed on the third floor of the White House. You probably know more about it than I do. And it was when the Queen actually was having bed rest. She was pregnant. She saw a picture of Eisenhower in the paper, and he was cooking quail on a shooting weekend with a friend in the countryside, and it jogged her memory, and she sent the recipe for 16 people to make these drop scones with a little handwritten note talking about the different ingredients that should go and all the quantities that should go in. And it's reprinted in the book.
So the next relationship evolving from the Eisenhowers would have been the Kennedys. And the Watchers of the Crown, of course, were treated to that dynamic of the dance between the young Queen Elizabeth and the First Lady of the United States, Jacqueline Kennedy, and what that tension, what that relationship, what that comparison was like. But what did Mrs. Kennedy encounter with Queen Elizabeth? And what did Queen Elizabeth think, not really of Mrs. Kennedy so much, but of this young American president?
It is, of course, coloured by that famous episode of The Crown, which portrayed Elizabeth as rather envious of the glamorous Jackie Kennedy, the fantastic state visit they'd just had to France, where she was regarded as the height of modern fashion, very chic. And Elizabeth, who had been a bit of a cover girl in the 1950s, was well and truly now been knocked off the magazine covers by Jackie Kennedy. But it wasn't quite as portrayed in The Crown, or at least the reason for tension between them was somewhat different, because Jackie and JFK were visiting actually privately, in a way, for a christening of Jackie's sister's daughter. And Jackie wanted to go to dinner with her sister and brother-in-law. The problem was it was Jackie's sister's second marriage, and the brother-in-law was on his third marriage, and divorcees were not welcome at formal Buckingham Palace events in the early 1960s.
Especially American divorcees. There had been a recent history with that.
I wouldn't say that they'd singled out Americans necessarily. It was just really a symbol of hidebound post-war Britain. So the officials went back and forth. From the palace was resisting having Jackie's relatives come to dinner. The Kennedys had also asked for Princess Margaret to be present, and another princess called Princess Marina, who was very fashionable. In fact, so fashionable she'd had a colour named after her, Marina Blue. She was she was a cover girl as well to some extent. Anyway, after much back and forth, JFK got a little fed up with it all and said, "Well, don't worry about us. We're on a private visit, really." And the government was very upset, and the palace was, I think, told to get its act together and to just invite Jackie's in-laws, because this is it's important not to antagonize our great allies, especially JFK, who was perhaps the greatest Anglophile of all of the post-war presidents, perhaps. And so the guests list was settled. Jackie and JFK turned up. Jackie's sister was at one end of a very long table. Jackie's brother-in-law was at the other far end of a very long table. No chance of them speaking to the Queen, of course, but they were there. However, as Jackie gossiped later to Gore Vidal, that there was no Margaret and there was no Marina. In fact, it was every Commonwealth agricultural minister they could find on that table. Well, actually, if you look at the guest list, there were no Commonwealth agricultural ministers, but you get the point.
Yes.
She wasn't very happy with the guest list as such. Another thing she said was really the springboard for the Crown episode, which was that she said, "I think the Queen resented me." So there was tension that night. It was all to do with the guest list, I think, and not so much with the Crown spent a lot of time with Prince Philip ogling Jackie, of course, and the Queen not enjoying that. But there was no lasting effect, I think, of that, because on a private visit just a year later, Jackie was invited to lunch at Buckingham Palace. I don't think from the record anyway, that the Queen and JFK really hit it off. I got the impression, as I say in the book, that he really preferred the Council of Men when talking politics, and of course his cabinet had no women in, and all his buddies were male at the time, who he really talked politics with. But it didn't matter in terms of the special relationship between Britain and America, because his great confidant in Washington was the British ambassador, David Ormsby Gore, who was an old friend of his from pre-war days, when JFK had been in London visiting extensively, visiting his father, the ambassador. And they had become firm friends, to the extent that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was Ormsby Gore who was consulted. You know, Jackie once burst in on them in a room in the White House where they had all the satellite photographs of Cuba laid out on the floor. We were trying to decide which ones to show the American people. It was just the British ambassador and the president.
The Kennedy presidency was cut short. Perhaps Queen Elizabeth thought that she would have had 4 years or 8 years to warm that relationship and build on that. We've already spoken that there was no direct rapport with President Johnson. But then comes President Nixon, and Nixon, being the political calculator that he was, maybe for the first time saw some benefit to the alignment with this crown thing and this Her Majesty. What was that relationship, and what was Nixon's operating motive with the Queen?
Now we had a president, again, who was an Anglophile. In fact, his family was so keen on the royal family that the Nixon and his siblings were named after British kings. He was named after Richard the Lionheart, believe it or not. But he had seen as vice president the strength of the relationship that the Queen had had with Eisenhower. Nixon had visited on a solo visit to the UK back in 1958 and hosted the Queen for her first ever Thanksgiving dinner at the American Embassy in London. He was a royal fan. And he wasted no time. But what happened subsequently was another cooling period in the special relationship, because the British government changed. We got a prime minister, a Conservative prime minister, Edward Heath, and he was focused on getting Britain into the European Union, the forerunner of the European Union. And the French were very suspicious that Britain looked too much to America and weren't committed enough to the European project. And Heath didn't really want to know much about America. He wanted to make sure that Britain was part of Europe. So that when Nixon made a flying visit to see Heath, the new prime minister, it was known that relations weren't going to be great between them. And the Queen, who was holidaying at Balmoral, she took a flight down just to be at the lunch, so she could be like the catalyst at the lunch between Nixon and Heath during that time. But the rapport with the royal family was rather good. And so Nixon invited the young Prince Charles, only 21, still a bachelor, to come and visit with him and stay at the White House.
Now, there may have been another subtle motive there with the young bachelor prince and the president with 2 daughters.
Yes, and there's plenty of evidence for what you're talking about there, Stuart, which is that when Nixon visited and saw the Queen and the Duke for lunch in London, the cameras were rolling. This was a very early, in fact, the first ever documentary made behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, and it caught President Nixon saying to the young Prince Charles, "Oh, my daughters take a great interest in you," on television. And Prince Philip is heard to say, "Well, surely one of them no longer." And that's because Nixon's daughter Julia just got married, and why would a married daughter take such a close interest in the bachelor prince? Tricia Nixon was unmarried, and when Charles made his visit to the White House in 1970, at every event that was arranged for him, a baseball game, a party on the White House lawn, a visit to Mount Vernon, a boat trip on the Potomac, there was Tricia Nixon alongside him every time in all of the photo opportunities and visits. And Prince Charles himself confirmed when he made a trip to see George W. Bush, actually his first one with Camilla as his consort, he joked in his after-dinner speech, "Oh, that was when they were trying to marry me off to Tricia Nixon."
Well, I'm sure Richard Nixon was thinking of the headlines, "Daughter of President marries future king." That would have been quite something.
So that was not the first time, actually, because the young Queen and unattached Queen Victoria had a little interest from one of your early presidents, Martin Van Buren.
Oh, my goodness.
Who himself, a widower, sent his son to the coronation of Queen Victoria. And there was a lot of perhaps gossip, I guess, in the media at the time that John Van Buren was carrying a message from his father, a special message for Queen Victoria. And then actually the mood shifted to when John was seen to have a dance with Victoria at coronation events in London. He earned the nickname Prince John in the media.
Wow.
And there was rumours about his chances of the hand of a British monarch. So it was not the first time there'd been some link between a presidency and a young monarch.
Well,
But,
maybe in the future, maybe Prince George will end up with an American wife. We'll see.
well, one of our kings did forsake the throne for an
Yes,
American.
that's true.
So
That is true. That is true. Well, after the Nixon presidency, of course, Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States. And an irony, we're celebrating the American bicentennial. And here is this British monarch, a multi-generation later successor to George III, comes over to the United States in observance of America's War of Independence from the very country that she leads.
yes, in fact, this invitation goes back to Nixon. Nixon envisaged this as a crowning triumph of his second term, the bicentennial celebrations, and invited the Queen. But it would be Ford who was president, of course, when the Queen did come over. But there was consternation behind the scenes in London about and deliberation about whether this was appropriate for the Queen to attend on July the 4th, the celebration of the overthrow of the British monarchy and rebellion against the throne. And there are memos in the files between senior officials saying, I think there will be a certain amount of zest and hullabaloo involved with this that wouldn't be appropriate for the Queen to be seen to be taking part in such a celebration. But it turned out to be one of the most, if not the most, successful royal visits to the White House. When she arrived a few days later after joining some ceremonial events, presenting a new version of the Liberty Bell, for example, in Philadelphia, that was originally, of course, made in London. She danced with the president, took the first dance at the big state dinner that night. Only slightly later, when the Associated Press had spotted that the music being played was The Lady as a Tramp,
Yes.
was there some controversy about it, but I'm told on the night nobody really noticed, apart from the AP reporter, that this was part of the medley of songs that were being played by the band.
Right. Still a bit embarrassing for the Marine band. So we enter the Reagan presidency, which we've talked about the relationship and the uniqueness of their sense of humor, their rapport. And then comes the presidency of George H.W. Bush. And there was an honor that was given to President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush. It was not given to the other presidents that she met. Tell us about that.
You may be referring to the honorary knighthood that is bestowed by the Queen on Reagan, that's right, because of the American assistance that was given during the Falklands conflict, when British forces went all the way down to the South Atlantic to retake these islands that had been occupied by Argentina, which has a claim on them. But Argentina tried to take them back by force. And we've talked about that horse ride, that there was a lot of back and forth between the officials to organize it. Well, almost in parallel, there was a lot of back and forth between military officials behind the scenes during the build-up to that Falklands conflict, when America was taking a fairly neutral stance in public, but really was providing a lot of intelligence and logistical help with the British forces. And a lot of this didn't come out at the time. The Queen knew about it, and the Queen was extremely aware of it, because her own son was a helicopter pilot in the task force that went to fight for the Falkland Islands. Prince Andrew was a Navy helicopter pilot, and the news was a bit grim at the time. Both British and Argentinian servicemen were being killed in this conflict. And so the help that Reagan ensured was given to Britain with that was rewarded. The knighthoods in these cases are decided by the political leaders at the time. George H.W. Bush, similarly, for the conduct of the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was chased out of Kuwait very successfully under the the leadership of Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. That again was commemorated with a knighthood. Both of those presidents received honorary knighthoods from the Queen, who bestows them at a lunch at Buckingham Palace.
Do you think she had any spirit of camaraderie with President George W. Bush, since she may have seen him as the prince to his father? Obviously, George W. Bush didn't inherit the presidency, but they would have both ascended into their roles with their fathers both preceding them.
There was a real camaraderie with the Bushes. I don't think it was quite that dynamic. I think it was that when she first met the Bushes on the state visit of 1991 and had a lunch with the Bush family, and George W. Bush was there, he was not shy about making a few jokes and quips that the Queen loved, because behind the scenes she did love to relax, as you say, and enjoyed a few jokes. So George W. Bush was initially introduced by Barbara Bush as by saying, "Oh, I put my Texan son down the end of the table just in case he says something," and the Queen was heard to remark, "Oh, why is he the black sheep of the family?" And George W. Bush can hear this, and he's saying, "Well, I'm sure every family's got one. Who's yours?" Barbara Bush by this stage is like, "Well, please don't answer that." But anyway, a rapport is being built with the Bush family, which is, and I say this in the book, I think Barbara Bush was perhaps, if I had to say which First Lady was the one who was the most favourite for the Queen. It's another matriarch with a big family and slightly troublesome offspring at times, who grew up to be leaders and grew up in the public eye, but also animal people like dog people who delighted in having dogs. Not so much horsey people like Reagan was, but also George H.W. Bush did ride, of course. And so all of those things combined to just add that personal flavour that took some of the relationships just a bit above and beyond. So much so that when George W. Bush welcomed the Queen to the White House, and he meant to say that you joined our bicentennial celebrations in 1976. He actually said, "And you joined our celebrations in 1770s." And he stopped himself, but there was a laughter from the crowd who were watching, and the Queen gave him a glance, and George W. Bush said, "Well, she gave me a look that only a mother could give a child." And that to me suggested a familial relation almost between them, that he would feel relaxed enough to say that to the Queen in a big formal event, the welcoming to the White House. And that just showed, I think, it was indicative of a very warm and convivial relationship on a personal level.
Our most recent three American presidents, of course, she would have had some interaction with. Each of them, and she's in a much different place than she would have been as a young, vibrant queen with Reagan and with Eisenhower and Kennedy. What was that dynamic like with the three most recent American presidents?
Well, the Queen had stopped travelling on big overseas trips, although she did make a very brief trip to New York in 2010 to see the 9/11 memorial. It was a small diversion from a Canada trip, and she did not see President Obama on that trip. However, she was really deployed, if you like, by her country in a diplomatic role with all three of Obama, Trump, and Biden, as Britain's relations were called into question in different ways with each of those three presidents. So with Obama, first of all, there was a question as to whether he really had an affection for Britain in the same way as previous presidents. And so the remedy, as so often in relations with America and other countries, was when Obama came over to a big international summit in London, he's the one who gets lunch with the Queen. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are invited into Buckingham Palace, and they have the audience and the private lunch. None of the other leaders get this, of course. This is a special deal for the American leader. And it's clear from the press conferences, both before and after, that it's a really meaningful and exciting event for the new president and first lady to do that. And a relationship develops almost unexpectedly that diplomats said to me they saw, they think, Obama warm to Britain because he really enjoyed the company of the Queen. And later on in his presidency, when he realized that the Queen wasn't traveling anymore and the Queen was turning 90, he arranged it in his final year to come over to Britain for her, to wish her a happy birthday for her 90th birthday. And that had political benefits for the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, because we were in the middle of a referendum on membership of the European Union, and President Obama delivered a soundbite for David Cameron that Britain would be at the back of the queue for a trade relationship with America if it's voted to leave the EU. Now, it didn't work, but it was exactly the kind of diplomatic spin-off that so often came from these personal meetings between the Queen and an American president. They're so often geared around some political goal, as you know, all the way from repairing the Suez Crisis up to trying to influence the European referendum that Britain held. And similarly, when President Trump came in, there was uncertainty in Britain exactly how he would work with the country and whether we, Britain, would get a trade deal with America that was seen to be a potential benefit from Brexit, if only it could be achieved. And so what happens? The first Prime Minister to go and see Trump is Theresa May, the British Prime Minister. In her back pocket, she's got an invitation. How about a state visit to come and see the Queen? This is really unprecedented to offer a state visit in the first month of an American presidency. It took a couple of years to organise, but the whole point of it was, here's the best diplomatic card the Brits can play. You can have a few days of pomp and ceremony with the Queen. President Trump, when he came in 2019, and this was the final state visit ever hosted by the Queen at Buckingham Palace, was absolutely thrilled to get all of this time one-on-one with the Queen, because it went back to childhood memories of his Scottish mother watching the coronation on television when he was a boy, and seeing just how thrilled she was by the British monarchy.
And then President Biden.
Again, there were British concerns that President Biden, because of his Irish heritage, was not that well disposed to Britain. He, unlike Trump, was not a fan of the Brexit departure from the European Union, and perhaps relations would be a bit cold again. And so there's a summit in Cornwall in the south of Britain, and who gets the special invitation up to Windsor Castle from all of the leaders at the Cornwall summit? It's President Biden, and the First Lady get afternoon tea and crumpets at Windsor Castle in 2021 with the 95-year-old Queen. And far from it being something of a chore for Biden, he again is clearly rather delighted, I think, to spend that time with the Queen, and emerges to say, well, she reminded me of my mother. And that carries extra special meaning in the British context for Biden, because it was his mother who was a very strong Irish Republican who did not care for British rule in Northern Ireland at all. And in fact, on the only previous occasion that Biden had visited with the Queen as a senator back in the 80s, he had spoken to his mother beforehand, and she had said, "Don't you bow down to her." She had also said when he met the Pope, "Don't you bow down to him." But generally speaking, there was nervousness about President Biden's attitude and reaction to Britain, and they were dispelled by this special magic that's deployed by the Queen.
Britain is no stranger to strong women monarchs, with Elizabeth, Victoria, Elizabeth I, centuries of tradition. Do you think Queen Elizabeth wondered why America did not have a woman president during her lifetime?
Well, that's a good question, Stuart, and I think we mustn't second guess the Queen. You know what? Throughout her diplomatic career as head of state, she was very careful in public and actually in private to keep her political thoughts quite deeply buried within herself and in her small coterie of advisors and family. And what she was good at doing is taking what she found. Now, whether that was a President Obama, a President Trump, or a President Biden, and that was making them feel in the special part of the special relationship, and doing her best, whatever the potential reaction and feelings of the person she's meeting, the other head of state, not only to put them at their ease, but to encourage feelings of warmth and friendliness, firstly to her, I suppose, and her family. But really what it's all about is it's a diplomatic effort to sell her country and to convey also the values that she believed in.
After a 70-year reign, Queen Elizabeth passes and the crown goes to her son, King Charles. Himself, who has been to America many times, has not been yet as king. What is the difference in, or is there a difference between how a King Charles sees, will embrace, will engage with America different than his mother?
Because of his long time spent as the heir to the throne, Charles became a little more involved in causes that he believed in. He made it his occupation to campaign for the environment a lot more. That's the natural environment, also the built environment. He was a fan of a certain styles of architecture and building, as well as stewardship of the land, and a concern for climate change and the environment. And those things are well known about him. He's got strong views on that. He's not shy about putting a slightly more political edge on the causes that he believes in. So that is definitely a difference to Queen Elizabeth, who, you know, she became queen at such a young age, in her mid-20s, that she lived a whole life of presenting a very careful, diplomatic, measured approach that didn't give away too much.
Well, I have to say that here at the White House Historical Association, we have our own special relationship through your wonderful, extraordinary, amazing British ambassador, Dame Karen Pierce, is a terrific friend of our work, our mission. She's joined us on many occasions here, hosted us at her residence and at the embassy, and is an extraordinary ambassador and has kept the fires of friendship burning. Now, we don't like to use the word fires in the context of our British friends because we do give her a hard time about the British setting fire to the White House in 1814. Yeah. But it's amazing that having fought a revolution against the crown, your country, and then had other skirmishes early in our history, that the bond of friendship exists. And certainly the persona, the person, the heart, the mind, the lady of Queen Elizabeth II was so important and integral to that relationship for the past 70 years. And this book is a wonderful story of her relationship with our country, embodied through these 13 presidents with whom she had a very interesting and personal relationship with. So thank you for sharing this story. Very important to White House history. Queen Elizabeth is a frequent and wonderful guest of monarchs that we've hosted here in our country. And I think when her funeral was broadcast here, I can't imagine the number of millions of Americans that were tuned into that out of respect and regard for this wonderful, wonderful Queen Elizabeth II.
Thank you, Stuart. It's been a pleasure talking with you about her relationship with all the presidents. We couldn't get into absolutely everyone and every twist and turn, but the fundamental point of the book is to show that here was a woman who embodied Britain's belief in America and commitment to American values and philosophy as much as anything. And she felt that she shared, I think, in an understanding of what America stands for, and made that very clear in her speeches with American presidents.
The book is Royal Audience, 70 Years, 13 Presidents, One Queen's Special Relationship with America by David Charter. Thank you, David, for sharing this with us and for taking the time to invest in this wonderful book. And we didn't go into every story, and that's why people need to get the book and read it. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode. And please watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping fund the education mission through our teacher programming, our publishing, our White House History Live in-person and virtual events, the members-only virtual history Happy Hour, and our latest initiative, The People's House, a White House experience. We're bringing the White House and its storied history to life at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. The People's House is an immersive experience and open to everyone. Plan your visit today at the website, thepeopleshouse.org. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.